Hello and welcome to another episode of Old World Botany. In this episode, we'll talk about the history and domestication of Umeboshi. Umeboshi literally means dried ume, which is a type of apricot, although commonly described as a plum. This plum/apricot is typically preserved by drying it in salt to create a sour and salty dried fruit, utilized heavily in rice, and in the production of other goods such as banchachi and tempura. A sauce called beiniku is also made from umeboshi puree. This species is called Prunus mume and is speculated to be of Chinese origin, where it then transferred into Japan as time went on. In this episode, we'll talk about the history and dissemination of the species, starting off with the natural history of the species, followed by the dissemination routes of the species. Let's get started. A paper by Dr. Koji Numaguchi of Kobe University within Japan did a paper studying the interspecific introgression and natural selection that went into creating the Japanese apricot, or umeboshi, or Prunus mume, whichever name you choose. Since this species is closely related to the common apricot, and a common apricot can crossbreed with the Japanese plum, the researchers speculated that crossbreeding between these three species occurred at various intervals throughout history. Indeed, prior studies showcased that there has been some level of hybridization between these two species, specifically the Japanese apricot and a common apricot. The goal of the paper being referenced is to figure out how the species change over time through natural selection and artificial selection. Utilizing this information, they were able to distinguish three different groups of cultivars: the Chinese cultivars, the Japanese cultivars, and the ornamental cultivars, as well as the Taiwanese cultivars. And here are the results of these analyses. It was revealed that the Chinese and Japanese cultivars differ genetically by a considerable margin. The ornamental class of Umeboshi is derived from a very narrow set of genetic resources, making it very inbred and low in variability. The Taiwanese class of Umeboshi is derived entirely from Japanese strains. It appears that there are wild Umeboshi found both in China and Japan, indicating that rather than the Japanese strains being bred from the Chinese strains, it appears that Umeboshi was domesticated twice, once in Japan and once in China. There have also been some examples, specifically in 8 cultivars of Japanese Umeboshi have interbred with Chinese cultivars, creating hybrid varieties that have varying degrees of both lineages within their pedigree. Based on various scanning techniques for genetic traits, they found remnants of various genes commonly found within the common apricot, such as PRUP 1G 161800 and POZ-MAF-TRAF. A small portion of the genes for tolerance of biotic and abiotic stresses, such as disease or drought, appear to have origins in the common apricot, it seems. These traits seem to be mostly found within Japanese cultivars. The Taiwanese cultivars of Umeboshi seem to have some interesting traits found only in Japanese plum, or Prunus salicina, and it appears that crossbreeding between these two species may have happened. So much like the pluoc can be made by crossbreeding a Japanese plum with an apricot, a Japanese apricot or Umeboshi can crossbreed with a Japanese plum as well, as small traces of Japanese plum pedigree are found within Taiwanese cultivars, as well as some Japanese cultivars. The interesting phenomenon of these three species intergressing with each other may indicate that these three species share a common ancestor, and the Japanese plum could actually be considered an apricot, as these three species can frequently crossbreed with each other through natural and artificial processes. It appears after domestication that a greater deal of integration happened, especially within the Japanese and Taiwanese cultivars, whilst the Chinese cultivars remain genetically unaltered through this process. Now on to the domestication and dissemination of the species. This paper is by Dr. Zhao Hong of the Nanjing Agricultural University of Nanjing, Jiangsu, China. He did extensive work alongside his colleagues to try to figure out how the plant was disseminated throughout history, and how each step affected the plant, utilizing genetic technology, and here are the results. The first thing that was discovered was that the wild group has more genetic variation by a considerable margin than the domesticated group. Based on 148 accessions studied by this paper, the populations of Umeboshi from Zhejiang, Japan, and Taiwan form close related clusters similar to what's found in Tibet, Yunnan, and Guizhou. I'm definitely butchering those names. My apologies. Several clusters were created. Cluster 1 includes wild samples from Tibet, Yunnan, and Beji, as well as certain clades of domesticated Chinese Umeboshi. Cluster 2 consists of 2 domesticated varieties and wild samples found in Guizhou. Cluster 3 included wild Zhengyang samples, Japanese cultivars, and domesticated varieties from Guangdong, Taiwan, Zhejiang, and Hunan. Cluster 4 included wild samples from Fujian, Guangdong, domestic varieties of Sichuan, Fujian, and Taiwan, and Yunnan. I again may be butchering some of these names. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Based on the genetic analysis, here's what was found. The wild germplasm from Tibet and Gansu acts as a secondary center of origin for the species. The primary center of origin for the whole species would be Yunnan area, with a secondary population being an offshoot based in southwest China. The wild samples found in Libo, Zhejiang, Fujian, and Guangdong seem to be derived from these secondary sources. The domesticated varieties of Japanese bred varieties, Zhejiang varieties, Guangdong varieties, and Taiwan varieties, as well as Sichuan, Hunan, and Yunnan, and Fujian varieties seem to be derived from the same source. All forms of Umeboshi seem to be derived, likewise, from intergression from other wild varieties from elsewhere, such as the ones from Tibet and Zhejiang. Most branches of the Umeboshi species seem to be derived wholly from Yunnan or Tibet. The Chinese varieties seem to be derived entirely from the Yunnan branch, while the Japanese and Taiwanese cultivars seem to be derived from a mixture of both branches of this unique species. The researchers conclude that since the Zhejiang area, which had the Umeboshi varieties derived from multiple lineages, it is speculated that the Japanese, through trade with the Chinese during the Tang dynasty, obtained the primordial strains that became the Japanese cultivars of Umeboshi. This seems to be confirmed due to the fact that the domesticated forms of Umeboshi within Japan are lower than what is found within China. And that about covers everything. Thank you for watching.